Gorki Estate, outside Moscow, January 21st, 1924. The afternoon light is fading over the snow-covered grounds of the Gorki Estate, the country property outside Moscow that has served as Vladimir Lenin's residence and medical facility for the final years of his life. It is a Monday. The temperature is well below freezing. The grounds are quiet in the way that places become quiet when something significant is happening inside, and the people outside are waiting without quite knowing what they are waiting for. Inside the main house, in the upper floor room that has been arranged to accommodate the specific medical requirements of a patient who has been declining for nearly 2 years, the most consequential political figure of the 20th century is dying. He has been dying for some time, the decline so gradual and so complete that the boundary between dying and the state that preceded it has become difficult to locate precisely. But today is different. Today, the process that has been consuming him is reaching its conclusion. At 6:50 in the evening, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known to history as Lenin, dies. He is 53 years old. In the room with him, and in the rooms and corridors immediately surrounding, are the people who have been managing his final period. His wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, his sister, Maria Ulyanova, the physicians who have been responsible for his care, and various other figures whose institutional or personal connections have placed them in this specific location at this specific moment. Among them is Nikolai Alexandrovich Semashko, the People's Commissar of Health, the head of the Soviet medical system, Lenin's longtime comrade and the physician who occupied the intersection of Soviet medicine and Soviet politics in ways that made him uniquely positioned to know what was happening and uniquely constrained in what he could say about it. What happened in that room, fully and completely, is something that the century since has not been able to entirely recover. What Semashko knew about what happened and chose not to say is the mystery at the center of one of the most consequential deaths in modern history. This is the attempt to understand both. To understand the final hours of Lenin's life, it is necessary to understand the 2 years that preceded them, the progressive dismantling of one of the most formidable political intellects of the modern era by the cerebrovascular disease that his physicians documented and that subsequent medical historians have analyzed with the advantage of retrospective examination. Lenin's first major stroke occurred on May 25, 1922. He was 51 years old, and the event arrived with the specific combination of suddenness and inevitability that characterizes vascular accidents in people whose underlying disease has been progressing silently for years. The stroke left him temporarily unable to speak clearly, with weakness on his right side, and with the fatigue and cognitive difficulty that follow significant brain injury. The medical team assembled to treat him was exceptional by the standards of early 1920s medicine. Soviet physicians were supplemented by German specialists brought specifically for Lenin's case, reflecting the leadership's understanding that the best available expertise had to be applied regardless of cost or political complication. Among the German specialists was Ottfried Förster, one of the most distinguished neurologists in Europe, whose involvement in Lenin's case gave his diagnosis and prognosis a weight that the Soviet physicians recognized and deferred to in significant measure. Förster's assessment, along with those of the Soviet physicians, including Alexei Kozhevnikov and Vladimir Osipov, converged on the diagnosis of cerebral arteriosclerosis, the progressive narrowing and hardening of the blood vessels supplying the brain, as the primary explanation for Lenin's symptoms. This diagnosis carried a specific and unwelcome implication. There was no cure, no treatment that could reverse the underlying pathology, only management of symptoms and the attempt to slow progression through rest and reduced stress. The political implications of this medical reality were immediately understood by everyone involved in Lenin's care. A diagnosis of incurable progressive cerebrovascular disease in the leader of the Soviet state was not simply a medical finding. It was a political event of the first order, one that the Soviet system was profoundly unprepared to process openly. The party had been built around Lenin's leadership in ways that made his incapacity a systemic crisis, and the management of information about his condition was therefore a political operation from the moment the first stroke occurred. The question of what to tell Lenin himself about his diagnosis and prognosis was one that the medical team and the political leadership had to address. The documentation of the period, including the physician's notes and the testimony of people present during the medical consultations, indicates that Lenin was told less than the full reality of his condition. The specific reasons for this managed disclosure included both the general medical convention of protecting seriously ill patients from information that might worsen their psychological state, and the specific political calculation that Lenin's response to full knowledge of his situation might produce political actions that the current leadership was not prepared to manage. The summer and autumn of 1922 saw a partial recovery, sufficient for Lenin to return to limited work and to engage with the political and governmental matters that continued to require his attention. But the recovery was incomplete, and the underlying disease continued its progression even as the visible symptoms temporarily receded. The physicians who monitored him through this period documented the pattern of partial improvement and underlying deterioration that characterizes cerebrovascular disease in its progressive form. It was during this period of partial recovery that Lenin began the dictation of the works that collectively constitute what historians call his testament and his late writings. He dictated to his secretaries in short sessions when his condition permitted, building the documents that addressed the succession question, that warned about Stalin, that assessed the qualities and weaknesses of the party's senior figures. The dictation sessions were conducted under medical supervision and with the awareness that each session was a finite use of a capacity that was diminishing rather than recovering. Semashko's institutional position during this period gave him access to information about Lenin's condition that went beyond what his formal role alone would have provided. As People's Commissar of Health, he was the institutional head of the system providing Lenin's care. As Lenin's longtime political comrade, he was among the people with personal access to the man himself. And as a physician, he had both professional obligations to his patient and professional standing to evaluate the medical assessments that the team was making. His presence at the Gorki Estate was regular during the period of Lenin's illness, his visits documented in the estate's records and in the accounts of other people present. He was one of the figures who moved between the medical world of Lenin's care and the political world of the Soviet government, with a fluency that reflected his unique institutional position at the boundary of these two domains. The second major stroke in December 1922 was more severe than the first, more damaging in its immediate effects, and more definitive in its implications for Lenin's capacity to continue working. It left him more significantly impaired, reduced his ability to speak and to write, and forced the much more complete withdrawal from political work that characterized his final 14 months. The partial recovery from the first stroke was not repeated. The trajectory after the second stroke was consistently downward, punctuated by periods of relative stability rather than genuine improvement. It was in the aftermath of the second stroke that the management of Lenin's condition became most politically consequential. Stalin's specific role in managing Lenin's medical arrangements, formalized in early 1923, gave him institutional authority over who saw Lenin, what communications reached him, how his medical situation was presented to the party, in ways that served Stalin's political interests, even as they were framed as concern for Lenin's health and recovery. The documented conflict between Krupskaya and Stalin over Lenin's access and communications is one of the most significant political sub-stories of this period. Krupskaya's complaint to Kamenev about Stalin's rude treatment of her feeling that the restrictions being placed on Lenin's communications were not purely medically motivated, and Lenin's subsequent letter to Stalin breaking off personal relations all constitute a documented record of the political tensions surrounding the management of Lenin's final period. The third and most devastating stroke, in March 1923, left Lenin unable to speak or to write. He survived in this condition, largely incapacitated, through the spring and summer and autumn of 1923 and into January 1924. The final 10 months of his life were spent in a state of profound incapacity, with the physicians documenting occasional periods of apparent awareness and responsiveness, but no recovery of the communicative and cognitive capacities that had defined him. The atmosphere at the Gorki Estate during Lenin's final months was documented in the accounts of people who were present, and these accounts convey a specific quality of waiting, of the suspended time that surrounds someone who is dying slowly in a place that has been organized around their dying. The medical staff maintained their routines. The family members who were present, primarily Krupskaya and Maria Ulyanova, organized their lives around the rhythms of his care. The political world outside continued its operations, the succession struggle proceeding in ways that Lenin could no longer observe or influence. The physicians attending Lenin during his final months included both the Soviet doctors who provided day-to-day care and the German specialists who continued to consult on his case. Forster remained involved in Lenin's care until near the end, his presence at Gorki documented in the medical records and in the accounts of participants. The regular documentation of Lenin's condition, the medical bulletins and case notes that the physicians maintained, constituted the official record of his decline. But the official record was not the complete record. The physicians operated in a political environment that shaped what was documented and how, and the management of information about Lenin's condition for public consumption was a distinct and parallel operation to the clinical management of the condition itself. What was communicated to the Soviet public, what was communicated to the party membership, and what was known to the physicians and the innermost circle were different layers of reality, each shaped by the political requirements of the moment. Semashko was positioned across all these layers. He knew the clinical reality with the specificity of a physician who had been involved in the oversight of Lenin's care. He knew the political reality with the comprehensiveness of a senior party member who was part of the inner circle's discussions. And he knew the gap between these two realities, the distance between what the clinical situation actually was and what was being communicated about it, with the uncomfortable precision of someone who occupied both domains simultaneously. The day of January 21st, 1924, began at Gorki with the specific routines that Lenin's care required. The medical staff attended to his needs in the morning. The people present at the estate, his family members and the attending physicians, organized themselves around the patterns that weeks of this existence had established. What is documented about the events of that specific day comes from the accounts of people who were present. Krupskaya's subsequent statements, the physicians' records, the accounts of other household members, and the official medical bulletin that was issued following Lenin's death. These sources provide a partial picture of the day's events, sufficient to establish the broad sequence, but incomplete in the specific details that would allow a full reconstruction of what happened. Lenin experienced a significant deterioration in his condition during the afternoon of January 21st. The physicians were summoned. The pattern of the final hours, as documented in the available accounts, involved the rapid progression of what the physicians characterized as a new and severe cerebrovascular event, the final catastrophic failure of the blood supply to a brain that had been progressively damaged across nearly 2 years of vascular disease. Krupskaya was present. Maria Ulyanova was present. The attending physicians were present. The specific sequence of who arrived when, of the medical interventions attempted and their results, of the observations made during the final hours, is documented in the physicians' accounts, but with the incompleteness that characterizes all such accounts when the events they describe are simultaneously medical and politically sensitive. At 6:50 in the evening, Lenin died. The official cause of death, as documented in the autopsy report that was produced in the days following, was cerebral arteriosclerosis, with the final event being a catastrophic brain hemorrhage. The autopsy was conducted by a team that included both Soviet and German physicians, with Forster among those present, and the findings were documented in a report that was published, and that constituted the official medical record of Lenin's death. The autopsy findings were striking in ways that medical historians have noted across the centuries since. Lenin's brain showed extensive damage from the cerebrovascular disease that had been progressing since at least 1922. The left carotid artery was found to be so severely calcified as to be functionally closed, essentially non-functional as a blood supply pathway to the brain. Multiple areas of brain tissue showed the damage from previous ischemic events, the accumulated record of the strokes that had consumed his capacity over the preceding 2 years. The severity of the pathological findings documented in the autopsy was consistent with the diagnosis of cerebral arteriosclerosis that the treating physicians had made, and with the clinical course that Lenin had followed. The autopsy report provided what appeared to be a comprehensive natural explanation for his death, rooted in the progressive disease that everyone involved in his care had known about. But the autopsy findings also raised questions that have been discussed by medical historians ever since. Lenin was only 53 years old at his death, young by the standards of the severe cerebrovascular disease documented in the autopsy. The degree of pathological change found in his arteries was more consistent with much older patients, and the specific severity of the disease at his age has prompted discussion of what factors might have contributed to such accelerated vascular aging. The leading explanation advanced by medical historians, consistent with the autopsy findings and with the hereditary information available, is that Lenin had a genetic predisposition to severe early-onset cerebrovascular disease, supported by the fact that his father died of a cerebral hemorrhage in his mid-50s. The hereditary pattern, combined with the extraordinary physical and psychological stresses of Lenin's revolutionary career, provides a medically coherent explanation for the severity of his disease at a relatively young age. The question of syphilis and neurosyphilis as a contributing or alternative explanation has been raised in the medical and historical literature, and deserves consideration as a historical question, even if it remains unresolved as a medical one. Some medical historians have argued that certain features of Lenin's clinical course are more consistent with the neurosyphilitic process than with simple cerebrovascular arteriosclerosis, noting the pattern of the disease's progression, the specific neurological symptoms, and the clinical response to certain treatments. The historical evidence available does not allow a definitive resolution of this question. The treating physician's private notes, which would potentially document their consideration of this diagnosis, are not fully accessible in the available archive. The publicly available records are those that the Soviet medical establishment chose to make public, and the management of those records reflects the political sensitivities of the period rather than a commitment to complete transparency. What is documented is that the German physicians treating Lenin in 1922 and 1923 consulted with each other about the diagnosis in private correspondence that has been partially recovered and analyzed by historians. The correspondence reflects the physicians' uncertainty about some aspects of Lenin's diagnosis, their consideration of multiple possible explanations for his clinical presentation, and the specific constraint that they operated under in terms of what could be said publicly about the leader of the Soviet state. If syphilis or neurosyphilis was among the diagnoses considered by the treating physicians, and if they chose not to document this consideration in the records that would be made public, the reasons for that omission would be understandable within the political environment of the period. Syphilis carried severe stigma in the 1920s, and a syphilis diagnosis in Lenin would have had political implications for the movement he led, and for the cult that was already being built around his image even before his death. The management of the diagnosis would have been as much a political decision as a medical one. Semashko knew whatever the treating physicians knew. His institutional position as People's Commissar of Health gave him access to the medical consultations, the physicians' discussions, and the clinical records in ways that placed him among the best informed people about the full reality of Lenin's medical situation. He was not simply an outside observer. He was a physician who was institutionally responsible for the system, providing Lenin's care, and personally present at many of the moments that mattered. The question of what Semashko knew that he did not say is therefore not a peripheral question about a minor historical figure. It is a question about the central medical mystery of the most consequential death in the history of the Soviet state, asked about the person best positioned to answer it. His published writings about Lenin's illness, produced across the years following Lenin's death and continuing through the Stalin period, are documents of careful calibration rather than full disclosure. He wrote about the cerebrovascular arteriosclerosis diagnosis with authority and consistency, confirming the official medical account in its essential elements, while adding the personal and institutional details that his position had allowed him to observe. He wrote about Lenin's character during his illness, his patience, his attempts to engage with whatever work remained possible, the specific quality of his responses to the people around him during the periods when responsiveness remained. These writings are not without historical value. They provide details that other accounts do not, observations from someone who was present in ways that others were not, the specific texture of what the Gorki Estate was like during the period of Lenin's illness. They constitute a genuine contribution to the historical record, but they are bounded in specific ways that become visible when examined against what Semashko must have known. The political tensions surrounding the management of Lenin's illness, the conflict between Krupskaya and Stalin, the specific decisions about what Lenin was told and not told about his own condition, the question of what the treating physicians privately assessed about the diagnosis, none of these are addressed in Semashko's published writings. The gap between what he knew and what he said is visible as a gap, even if its precise contents cannot be determined from the outside. The reasons for this gap were practical and dangerous in the specific Soviet political environment of the post-Lenin period. By the time Semashko was writing most of his published reminiscences about Lenin, Stalin was consolidating his control of the party and the state with the methodical thoroughness that made any statement that complicated the official narrative politically risky. Saying things that raised questions about the management of Lenin's illness, that implicated specific political figures in the control of information about Lenin's condition, that suggested the official medical account might be incomplete, was saying things that could be characterized as anti-party activity. Semashko's survival through the post-Lenin period, through the succession struggle, through the consolidation of Stalinist power, through the Great Purge that consumed so many of his contemporaries, and through the Second World War and the post-war period, all the way to his death in 1949, may have reflected in part his management of what he knew about Lenin's final period. He was removed from the position of People's Commissar of Health in 1930, a demotion that reduced his institutional prominence while allowing his continued professional existence, and he spent the following decades in positions of reduced power but continued professional function. The specific detail of what happened in the room where Lenin died on the evening of January 21st, 1924, is documented in the accounts of Krupskaya and Maria Ulyanova and in the physician's records, but these accounts leave significant questions unanswered. The precise sequence of events during the final hours, the specific medical interventions attempted, the observations of Lenin's condition and awareness during the final period, the exact character of the final event. These details are present in the official record in summary form, but not with the completeness that would allow a full forensic reconstruction. The question of whether Lenin was conscious or aware during any part of his final hours is one that the available accounts address incompletely. The official medical account describes a rapid progression of the final cerebrovascular event, consistent with a massive brain hemorrhage that would have produced rapid loss of consciousness. Some accounts suggest that there were periods during the afternoon when Lenin appeared to be responsive, but the reliability and the interpretation of these accounts is uncertain. The question of who was present at the exact moment of death and what their accounts of that moment were is documented in broad terms, but not comprehensively. The official Soviet account of Lenin's death placed family members and physicians in the room, consistent with the documentation of who was at Gorki during this period. Whether Semashko was physically present in the room at the moment of death, or was at the estate but not in the room, or arrived after the death, is a detail that the available accounts do not definitively establish. His presence at Gorki on that day and in the days immediately following is documented. His involvement in the institutional response to Lenin's death, the organization of the medical examination, the management of the official communication of the death to the Soviet government and the public, was a function of his position as People's Commissar of Health. These functions are documented and are consistent with his institutional role. What is not documented or not documented in the publicly available record is the interior of his experience of those days, what he thought and felt about what he was observing, what he understood about the full medical reality of what had happened, and what decisions he made in those first hours and days about what to say publicly and what to keep to himself. The decision about preserving and displaying Lenin's body, which was made in the days immediately following his death, was one of the most consequential decisions of the entire post-Lenin period, and Semashko was involved in its institutional management. The proposal to preserve Lenin's body rather than to bury it came from within the Soviet political leadership, driven by the political uses of Lenin's continued physical presence that the emerging cult of Lenin identified. Krupskaya opposed the preservation based on her understanding of Lenin's own wishes and her view that the treatment of his body after death should be simple rather than elaborate. Her opposition was overruled by the political leadership, and the preservation was decided and implemented. The physicians and scientists who conducted the embalming, Boris Zbarsky and Vladimir Vorobyov, worked under the institutional framework of the People's Commissariat of Health, which Semashko headed, giving him institutional oversight of the operation, even as its political direction came from the leadership above him. The preservation of Lenin's body was accomplished through techniques that Zbarsky and Vorobyov developed specifically for this purpose, drawing on existing embalming science and extending it in ways required by the specific demands of long-term preservation for public display. The technical success of the operation, which has maintained Lenin's body in displayed condition for a century, reflects the scientific expertise applied to it. The political significance of the operation, the transformation of Lenin's corpse into a permanent fixture of Soviet political symbolism, was a decision that Semashko's institutional position required him to implement, regardless of whatever his personal views might have been. The Lenin cult that the preservation of his body anchored was itself a political development that Semashko participated in and contributed to through his published writings about Lenin. The specific form of these contributions, the celebratory tone, the emphasis on Lenin's personal qualities and revolutionary achievements, the absence of the critical or complicated observations that a fully honest account might have included, reflected the requirements of the cult and the political environment in which Semashko was writing. The unanswered questions about Lenin's death that remain in the historical record a century later are genuine historical questions, not simply speculation or conspiracy theorizing. They emerge from the specific character of the evidence, the partiality of the documentary record, the political management of information about Lenin's illness that occurred throughout his final years, the silence of key witnesses on key questions, and the specific gaps in the official medical account that careful historical examination has identified. The question of the full diagnosis, whether cerebral arteriosclerosis alone accounts for everything that the clinical record shows, or whether other pathological processes were present, remains technically unresolved. The question of the political management of Lenin's medical care, who controlled what information reached him and what was communicated about his condition, is answered in broad terms by the available documentation, but not in the specific operational detail that a full understanding would require. The question of what happened in the final hours at Gorki on January 21st, 1924, is answered by the official account in ways that are consistent with natural death from cerebrovascular disease, but that leave the specific sequence of events incompletely documented. And the question of what Semashko knew that he did not say, what he carried through 35 years of post-Lenin professional life, what he managed with the specific professional discretion of a physician who understood both the medical reality and the political constraints on its disclosure. That question is the one that points most directly to the gap at the center of the historical record. He was the People's Commissar of Health. He was Lenin's comrade and physician administrator. He was present through the years of Lenin's illness and in the period immediately following his death. He knew the treating physicians and their assessments. He had access to the medical records. He participated in the management of the official response to Lenin's death and in the institutional processes that followed. He lived until 1949. He published extensively about Lenin and about Soviet medicine. He made his specific contribution to the historical record through what he chose to say. What he chose not to say, the specific gaps in his account that become visible when examined against what his position would have allowed him to know, constitute the outline of a silence whose contents cannot be determined, but whose existence is itself part of the story. The last man to see Lenin alive is not simply Semashko. It is everyone who was in that room at Gorki on the evening of January 21st, 1924. The physicians and the family members and the household staff who were present at or near the moment of death. All of them carried their specific observations into the days and years that followed. Some spoke, some wrote, some were asked and answered, and some, in the specific ways that the Soviet political environment required, managed the boundaries of what they said with the care that survival in that environment demanded. Semashko is the figure whose position most comprehensively encompassed the medical and political dimensions of the situation, whose access was most complete, and whose published account is most clearly bounded by what the political environment allowed rather than by the limits of what he knew. Lenin died at 6:50 in the evening on January 21st, 1924. The cause of death was, in the broad strokes of the available evidence, the cerebrovascular disease that had been consuming him for nearly 2 years. The specific details of the final hours, the precise sequence of events, the full medical reality of what happened, and the inner knowledge of the people who were present, these are things that the historical record has not fully recovered. They may never be fully recovered. The Soviet archival system, even in the partial opening that followed the Soviet collapse, has not produced the complete medical records that would allow historians to answer all the questions that remain open. The people who knew most are dead. The specific knowledge that Semashko carried into his death in 1949 went with him into the silence that he had maintained throughout his post-Lenin years. The mystery of Lenin's final hours is real, not constructed, not the product of unfounded speculation. It is the natural result of a political system's management of the most sensitive information in its possession, the medical reality of its leader's death, conducted in a manner that served the political requirements of the moment rather than the historical requirements of transparency. Gorki Estate, January 21st, 1924, 6:50 in the evening. A man dies in a room above the snow-covered grounds of a country estate. The people in the room with him know what they observe. Some of them will say some of what they know. None of them will say all of it. The century since has been a long investigation into the gap between what was observed and what was said, between the medical reality of what happened and the political management of what could be disclosed about it. The investigation is not complete. The silence that began in that room has never been entirely broken. And Nikolai Semashko, the man who knew as much as any single person about what the silence concealed, carried his portion of it through 35 years of Soviet professional life, and took it with him when he died in 1949, the secret buried beneath the carefully managed account that his political environment had required of him throughout. What he never said remains unsaid. In the history of the Soviet state, that is not unusual. In the history of this specific death, this specific room, this specific evening, it is the fact that matters most. The last man to see Lenin alive knew things that history has not recovered. He chose to keep them, and the choice outlasted him, as these choices always do, leaving the questions open for the historians who came after, working with the incomplete record that the silence produced, trying to see through it to whatever truth lies on the other side. Some truths resist recovery. This may be one of them.